In the depths of the Kremlin, behind walls that concealed the machinery of one of history's most repressive regimes, Joseph Stalin maintained a private cinema. While millions of Soviet citizens faced strict censorship and limited access to cultural material deemed politically acceptable, the General Secretary of the Communist Party spent his evenings in a converted winter garden, seated always in the front row, watching films that would never reach ordinary theaters. This paradox reveals something essential about totalitarian power. Those who control what others see reserve for themselves the privilege of seeing everything. The cinema itself was a marvel of 1930s technology, equipped with 4 modern projectors, 2 serving as backups in case of mechanical failure. The chairs were soft, the atmosphere intimate. Screenings began late, never before 9 in the evening, and extended into the early morning hours, sometimes past 2 or 3. Stalin's nocturnal viewing habits became a ritual, one that shaped Soviet cinema policy more directly than any bureaucratic decree ever could. Understanding Stalin's relationship with film requires grasping a fundamental truth about Soviet cultural production during his rule. Cinema was not merely entertainment. It was a weapon, a tool of ideological instruction, a means of shaping consciousness across 11 time zones. Yet Stalin himself consumed films with the appetite of a true cinephile, someone who appreciated craft and narrative alongside political utility. His tastes were eclectic, spanning Soviet propaganda pieces and Hollywood productions, French melodramas, and American westerns. The Soviet press referred to him as the main audience for foreign films, a designation that carried both literal and symbolic weight. What Stalin watched, what he approved, what he praised or condemned, these judgments cascaded through the entire apparatus of Soviet cultural production. The first Soviet musical comedy, Jolly Fellows, premiered in 1934 during a period of intense debate within Soviet artistic circles about whether comedy itself was appropriate for socialist audiences. The question sounds absurd in retrospect, but in the ideologically charged atmosphere of the early Stalin years, every artistic choice carried political implications. Could laughter serve the revolution, or did it distract from serious class struggle? Stalin resolved this debate with characteristic finality. After viewing Jolly Fellows, he declared that the picture allowed one to relax in an exciting and fun way, that it produced the feeling one gets after a day of rest. This endorsement opened the floodgates for Soviet comedy. Director Grigory Alexandrov had created something new, a synthesis of American musical comedy techniques with Soviet subject matter. Yet, even success offered no protection in Stalin's Soviet Union. 2 of the film's writers, Vladimir Mas and Nikolai Erdman, were arrested during production and sentenced to 3 years of labor for spreading counter-revolutionary fables and satire. The contradiction was total. Stalin praised the film they helped create, while the security apparatus he commanded destroyed their freedom. Stalin's affection for American westerns might seem surprising, but it reflected his fascination with narratives of individual power and the imposition of order through force. John Ford's The Lost Patrol from 1934 became one of his favorites, a film he watched repeatedly. He admired westerns featuring John Wayne, particularly scenes showing the hero riding alone on horseback before bringing an unruly town to order through decisive action. This attraction was not merely aesthetic. Stalin saw in these narratives a reflection of his own self-conception, the strong leader who imposes order on chaos, who stands alone against disorder and prevails through will and violence. He liked The Lost Patrol so much that he commissioned a Soviet adaptation titled 13. The impulse to remake foreign films with Soviet characteristics became a pattern, a way of appropriating Western narrative techniques while maintaining ideological control over content. Chapayev, released in 1934, achieved a special status in Stalin's personal canon. The film dramatized the life of Vasily Chapayev, a Red Army commander during the Russian Civil War who became a folk hero. Boris Shumyatsky, who organized the Kremlin screenings, recorded in his diary that this was the first time he had ever witnessed Stalin watch a film in complete silence. The leader was transfixed. He would go on to view Chapayev 37 more times, an extraordinary number that speaks to something deeper than casual enjoyment. The film became a template for Soviet heroic narrative, combining historical subject matter with accessible storytelling and clear ideological messaging. The directors, Sergei and Georgy Vasilyev, shot 3 different endings, submitting them to Stalin for final selection. This practice, having the supreme leader choose among alternative versions, became standard procedure for important Soviet films. Stalin's aesthetic judgments were political acts, and filmmakers learned to anticipate his preferences, internalizing censorship before a single frame was shot. Charlie Chaplin's City Lights from 1931 revealed another dimension of Stalin's cinematic tastes. The story of a blind flower seller and the tramp who she mistakes for a wealthy man moved Stalin deeply. Director Mikhail Rohm recorded in his memoirs that Stalin cried during the final scene, a remarkable admission of emotional vulnerability from a man who cultivated an image of iron resolve. Stalin praised Chaplin as hard-working and scrupulous, recognizing in the filmmaker a fellow perfectionist. Yet this admiration had limits. Chaplin's The Great Dictator, which satirized fascist leaders, including a character clearly modeled on Hitler, remained banned in the Soviet Union. The reasons were obvious. The film's mockery of totalitarian leadership cut too close to home, and Stalin had no intention of allowing Soviet audiences to see dictatorship, even fascist dictatorship, subjected to ridicule. The parallel was too dangerous. Georgian cinema held special significance for Stalin, who was himself Georgian. The Last Masquerade from 1934, the first Georgian sound film, initially left him cold. He found it overly complex and confusing. But Stalin watched it again, and then a third time, and by the final viewing his assessment had reversed. He praised its subtle irony, its adequate understanding of events, and the quality of the acting. This pattern of multiple viewings was characteristic. Stalin believed that films revealed deeper meanings upon repeated exposure, that initial impressions could be misleading. This conviction shaped his approach to cinema more broadly. He demanded that Soviet films reward careful attention, that they contain layers of meaning accessible only through sustained engagement. Grigory Alexandrov's second musical comedy, Volga Volga, appeared in 1938 and became another Stalin favorite. The film followed provincial art collectives traveling to Moscow for a musical competition, showcasing their talents to the capital. It celebrated the Volga-Moscow Canal, a massive infrastructure project completed in 1937 using forced labor from the Gulag system. Tens of thousands of prisoners died during its construction, but Soviet cinema presented it as a triumph of socialist achievement. Volga Volga embodied this propagandistic transformation of brutal reality into cheerful spectacle. Legend suggests Stalin sent a copy to Franklin Roosevelt as an example of quality Soviet cinema, though whether Roosevelt watched it or what he made of it remains unclear. The film's success did nothing to protect its creators from Stalin's terror. Cameraman Vladimir Nilsson was arrested on espionage charges and executed by firing squad 3 months before the film's release. Excellence offered no immunity. Talent provided no protection. The machinery of repression operated independently of artistic merit. French cinema also appeared in Stalin's screening room. Under the Roofs of Paris, a 1930 romantic drama by René Clair about a love triangle, earned Stalin's approval for being joyful and pleasant, for not overstaying its welcome. The film reached Soviet screens 5 years after its French premiere, a delay that reflected the careful vetting process applied to all foreign cultural products. Stalin's willingness to watch and approve romantic melodramas from capitalist countries revealed the selectivity of Soviet cultural policy. Not all Western culture was rejected. Certain films, deemed harmless or even useful for demonstrating that not all Western art was decadent, received limited distribution. The arrival of Tarzan the Ape Man from 1932 in Stalin's collection came through an unusual route. The film apparently entered the Soviet Union as part of trophy materials seized from Germany after the Second World War, taken from Goebbels' archive outside Potsdam. State archives contain records of Stalin requesting a screening. According to Kremlin projectionist Alexander Ganeshin, Stalin enjoyed the film so much he ordered its release to Soviet theaters. He personally authored the accompanying caption, declaring that the movie depicted a man escaping the horrors of the capitalist world for the jungle, where he finally found freedom and happiness. This interpretation transformed a Hollywood adventure film into anti-capitalist allegory. Stalin's ability to read ideologically useful messages into entertainment products demonstrated his skill at appropriation, at bending cultural material to serve political purposes regardless of original intent. American actress Deanna Durbin became an unlikely favorite of the Soviet dictator through the 1943 musical comedy His Butler's Sister. Roosevelt reportedly gave the film to Stalin, knowing the Soviet leader would appreciate Durbin's performance. Stalin watched it multiple times, particularly enjoying a restaurant scene where Durbin's character sings Russian romance songs. This detail, the use of Russian language in an American film, created a point of connection that Stalin found charming. Soviet audiences responded similarly when the film received distribution, and American media dubbed Durbin the Queen of Moscow screens. The incident illustrates how cultural exchange continued even during wartime, how entertainment could serve diplomatic purposes, creating small moments of shared experience across ideological divides. Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible represented the most direct intersection of Stalin's cinematic preferences and his political self-conception. Stalin himself proposed the film's subject, fascinated by the 16th-century Tsar who centralized Russian power through ruthless elimination of rival boyar families. Stalin saw Ivan as a collector of Russian lands, a strong ruler who placed state interests above all else. Eisenstein completed the first part in 1944, delivering exactly what Stalin wanted, an epic portrayal of Ivan as a tragic but necessary figure whose violence served historical progress. The film earned Eisenstein the Stalin Prize First Class, but the second part, completed a year later, told a darker story. It depicted Ivan's descent into paranoid tyranny, showing the human cost of his methods with unflinching clarity. Stalin reportedly saw uncomfortable parallels with his own rule and banned both parts in a fit of rage. The ban remained in place until after Stalin's death. The incident demonstrated the limits of artistic freedom even for favored directors. Eisenstein had delivered what Stalin requested, but in doing so revealed truths Stalin preferred to keep hidden. Girlfriends from 1935 told the story of three women who became field nurses during the Civil War, motivated by awareness of acute social injustice. Stalin valued the film's mobilizing potential, its ability to inspire self-sacrifice for revolutionary causes. Yet, this appreciation did not save director Raisa Vassilyeva, who was executed in 1938 for alleged Trotskyism. The charge was almost certainly false, as were most accusations during the Great Terror, but truth was irrelevant. Stalin's approval of artistic work provided no shield against the security apparatus. The randomness of survival during this period created an atmosphere of total uncertainty. Excellence might be noticed and rewarded, or it might provoke jealousy and denunciation. There was no way to predict, no strategy that guaranteed safety. Maurice Tourneur's French film Katia from 1938 dramatized the forbidden romance between Russian Emperor Alexander II and young Duchess Katya Dolgorukova. The film never reached Soviet public screenings, but Stalin viewed it several times privately. His grandson, Alexander Berdyansky, later speculated that Stalin associated the story with something from his own life, though he did not elaborate. Stalin's personal life remained largely hidden. His marriages and relationships concealed behind the public persona of the devoted revolutionary. What private resonances Katya held for him remains speculative, but his repeated viewings suggest emotional engagement beyond political calculation. Mikhail Rohm's Butterball from 1934 marked the end of Soviet silent cinema and the beginning of Rohm's distinguished career, which would include major propaganda films about Lenin. Based loosely on a Guy de Maupassant story, Butterball earned Stalin's praise for being powerfully compiled, made with great scale and visual storytelling in mind. Stalin's ability to appreciate craft, to recognize technical excellence independent of immediate political content, coexisted with his willingness to destroy artists whose work or personal history he deemed problematic. This duality defined Soviet cultural production during his rule. Alexander Petrushko's The New Gulliver. From 1935, reimagined Jonathan Swift's classic as Soviet allegory. A Soviet boy dreams of being Gulliver and finds himself in Lilliput, where he witnesses worker rebellion against capitalist oppression. Stalin watched the film 4 times in 1 week, recognizing in it what he called a true Bolshevik message. He declared that it depicted with incredible truth and power the worker movement and the just strategy of arming proletarian rebellion against capitalists. This interpretation of a children's fantasy film as revolutionary instruction manual exemplified Stalin's tendency to read political meaning into all cultural production. Nothing was merely entertainment. Everything served ideological purposes, whether creators intended it or not. The Maxim trilogy, directed by Grigory Kozintsev and Leonid Trauberg between 1934 and 1938, followed a young worker's transformation into a revolutionary across 3 films. Stalin watched the trilogy repeatedly, articulating his belief that films revealed deeper meanings through multiple viewings. He admitted that he initially found the first installment cold and unappealing, but changed his assessment after a second viewing, deciding it was actually good. This willingness to revise initial judgments, to give films second chances, might seem generous, but it also created uncertainty for filmmakers. A negative first reaction from Stalin could doom a project, but sometimes negative reactions reversed. The unpredictability was itself a form of control. Stalin's film preferences reveal the contradictions at the heart of Soviet cultural policy during his rule. He appreciated Hollywood westerns and French melodramas while enforcing strict censorship on Soviet citizens. He wept at Charlie Chaplin's sentimentality while ordering the execution of Soviet artists. He commissioned epic films celebrating strong rulers while banning those that showed the dark consequences of authoritarian power. He praised films as ideologically correct while destroying their creators for alleged political crimes. These contradictions were not accidental or hypocritical in any simple sense. They reflected the totalitarian logic that those who wield absolute power exist outside the rules they impose on others. Stalin could watch anything because he was trusted by himself and his system to interpret correctly, to extract proper lessons, to remain ideologically pure regardless of exposure to foreign or potentially corrupting material. Ordinary Soviet citizens lacked this ideological immunity and therefore required protection through censorship. The long-term consequences of Stalin's approach to cinema extended far beyond his death in 1953. Soviet film production remained constrained by the patterns established during his rule. The expectation that films serve clear ideological purposes, the practice of political vetting and leader approval, the atmosphere of fear that discouraged experimentation. Some of the most talented Soviet filmmakers were killed during the terror. Others learned to self-censor, to anticipate political requirements, to avoid subjects or approaches that might provoke official displeasure. The cinema that emerged from this system produced some remarkable works, films that found ways to express human truth within severe constraints, but it also suppressed countless stories, silenced voices, and narrowed the range of possible expression. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Russian cinema faced the challenge of rebuilding creative culture after decades of political control. That process continues today, as contemporary Russian filmmakers navigate new forms of political pressure and censorship that echo, in different forms, the system Stalin created. The man who sat in the front row of his private Kremlin cinema, watching films from around the world, while his security services arrested directors and writers, established patterns of cultural control that outlived him by generations. His preferences shaped not only what was made, but what was possible to imagine making, and that legacy persists in how power and culture interact across the former Soviet space, even now.